When I received the news about my mother's worsening health, I had to make a quick decision to return home. My savings allowed me to buy a ticket for a cruise ship, which, although not a large luxury vessel, was sufficient for a swift journey towards my hometown. The ship was fairly compact. It didn't stand out among other cruise liners, but it had everything necessary for passengers. In winter, when I received the urgent news, the weather was harsh. The city where I lived was covered in a thick layer of snow, and the temperature had dropped below zero. Gray, heavy clouds obscured the sky, and the wind was blowing strongly, creating a sense of winter chaos. The streets were slippery, and every step outside required caution. I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, which I had been renting for several years. I had actually moved out from my mother's place a few years ago. When I turned 18, I needed more independence. The apartment was modest but comfortable, a single room with a kitchenette and a small bathroom. It was my own place, but I had always remained close to my mother in my heart, and her illness now suddenly drew me back to the family home. After packing the essentials, I got into a taxi that struggled through the slippery streets in the harsh winter conditions. When I arrived at the port, the large cruise ship, although not extraordinary or particularly elegant, looked solid enough to ensure a safe journey. Its outdated appearance and somewhat neglected details contrasted with the elegance one might expect from larger vessels. The ship, while unimpressive, provided basic comfort. The duration of the cruise was crucial in this case, considering my mother's health. The cruise was set to last 3 hours. The weather at sea was as cold as on land. The wind picked up and the waves, although not dangerous, were unsettling enough to fuel my fears. When the ship finally stopped, passengers began to gather at the entrance, preparing to board. I felt both excited and worried, but what was to follow exceeded my worst fears. 2 crew members stood on the deck by the entrance. They had wide smiles stretched from ear to ear, which were simultaneously unnatural and unsettling. The smiles were too wide, too motionless to be genuine. They seemed almost grotesque in their excessive expressiveness. Their faces were illuminated by the artificial lighting of the ship. I saw their eyes were cold and inscrutable, looking at us with some mysterious, disturbing interest. Every movement of their hands, every gesture was too fluid, as if they were mechanisms in a perfectly tuned machine. Upon boarding the ship, my unease did not diminish, although the atmosphere around me was still filled with winter's dark elegance. The ship, though not a massive cruiser like those used for longer voyages, had its own charm. The interior of the ship was filled with warm, yet artificial light, which contrasted with the cold, black-gray sky outside the windows. Approaching the main entrance, I noticed that the interior of the ship was spacious, with elegantly furnished areas designed to provide comfort for passengers. Shiny marble floors and gilded details along the walls added a luxurious touch to the place, though somewhat outdated. The corridors were wide, with bright, pastel wallpapers and large windows allowing views of the sea, which was now filled with heavy, gray clouds. The crew members, who had earlier welcomed us on board with those unnaturally wide smiles, were now strolling down the corridors, their faces still radiating unsettling joy. With each step, I passed another crew member, and their wide smiles seemed even more pronounced as their gaze passed over me. Every step, every interaction with them was like walking on a tightrope, where every minor change could lead to unpredictable consequences. As I walked through the deck, I noticed that the interior of the ship was designed with great attention to detail. In the main hall there were elegant sofas and armchairs surrounding round tables. On the walls hung paintings depicting maritime landscapes, which, in the winter light, looked less welcoming than usual. Passing by the bar and restaurant, I noticed elegant but slightly rusty furniture. The overall tone was subdued but warm in shades of brown and gold, giving the interior a classic, though somewhat old-fashioned look. Even here, the crew members' faces bore those unnatural smiles that seemed to be part of some choreographed performance. Something was very wrong. Finally, I reached my cabin, located on one of the lower decks. The cabin door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside, feeling a bit of my tension ease. The cabin was small but cozy, decorated in a simple yet elegant style. The walls were in warm beige tones, and the furniture, including a bed with a elegant spread, a desk, and a wardrobe, was neatly crafted, though visibly used. Through the cabin window I could see the sea, which now looked even more gray and turbulent, with waves crashing against the ship's hull. As I began to unpack, I felt my anxiety and tension coalescing into a sharp, penetrating unease. I started by taking out the essentials, a few pairs of warm clothes necessary for the winter weather, and documents. I placed them in the wardrobe, trying to keep things organized. On the desk, which was near the window, I set up a few personal items. Family photos, a small notebook, and a few books to pass the time during the 3-hour cruise. After spending a few minutes on the bed, trying to gather my thoughts and acclimate to the strange atmosphere of the ship, I suddenly heard a knock on the cabin door. I pressed the button to open the door and saw one of the crew members standing at the threshold. Unlike the others, there was no unnatural smile on his face. The man was dressed in an elegant uniform that perfectly matched the classic look of the ship, a navy blue jacket with golden buttons and a white shirt. Unlike the others, he did not have that unnatural smile on his face. He was holding a neatly folded sheet of paper, tied with a ribbon. "Good day, sir," he said, his voice warm but devoid of emotion. "I was informed that you did not receive the list of rules. It is important that you familiarize yourself with these rules to ensure your safety during the journey." I took the sheet from his hands. I unfolded the paper, revealing that it was carefully written in elegant script, suggesting attention to detail. At the top was date and time, and below in several points were rules that seemed as precisely formulated as they were disturbing. Here is what was on the list. Rule 1. Never make eye contact with the captain. If you break this rule, follow Rule 5. Rule 2. If you hear a soft scratching in your cabin, do not move, do not make any sound, and eventually, the scratching will stop. However, if the scratching intensifies instead, leave the cabin as quickly as possible and do not return to it for the rest of the voyage. It lives in the walls. Rule 3. Do not draw attention to yourself from the crew. Rule 4. When you leave your cabin, know that you are safe until you go down to the engine room. No one goes there because they are afraid of it. No one descends. In 1989, there was a macabre incident there. A woman named Mia was burned alive, leaving behind only a charred skeleton. So remember, you might notice a woman with long black hair at first. She will look normal, but after a moment, you don't want to know what happens next. Which is why no one goes down there. They are afraid of her. If you see her, find a hiding place as quickly as possible. It might not be too late. Rule 5. If you make eye contact with the captain, your only option is to jump into the icy sea. That's the only way I managed to survive. Although the list was written in a formal style, each of these recommendations seemed unnaturally detailed and somewhat exaggerated. The point about avoiding eye contact with the captain in particular made me uneasy. Combined with the strange smiles of the crew, everything began to fit into a disturbing puzzle. As soon as I finished reviewing the list, I noticed that the man had vanished, as if he had disappeared into thin air. I heard no footsteps in the corridor. He had simply vanished. I didn't know what to think about it, so I decided to check the cabin again and make sure everything was in order. After a moment of contemplation about what I had witnessed and read, I felt I needed to stay alert and not be deceived by appearances. My thoughts returned to my mother's condition and how important it was, despite all these oddities, to focus on the purpose of my journey. I decided to leave the cabin to ask one of the crew members about the duration of the cruise. I still had the disturbing rules on my mind, but now the most important thing was to find out how much longer I would have to spend on this ship. Hoping it would be a short period, I headed towards the main corridor. When I reached the corridor, I noticed that the crew was still moving along it, with those unsettling, unnatural smiles on their faces. I stopped one of the employees, a young woman in an elegant uniform. Her smile, though wide, was somewhat more subtle than some of the other crew members. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound calm. "I wanted to ask how much longer this cruise will last." The woman looked at me, her smile unchanged, but her eyes were cold and inscrutable. "The cruise will last approximately 3 more hours. She answered with a voice that sounded like a metallic melody, somewhat monotone but polite. "Unless there are any unforeseen circumstances." I felt something was definitely wrong. If we had 3 more hours left and at least 30 minutes had passed since departure, it meant that the cruise was not as short as it should have been. This caused me deep anxiety. Were we actually traveling longer than expected? Worried, I slowly turned and returned to the cabin. I set a timer on my phone and waited another 30 minutes. When the phone screen showed 30 minutes had passed, I decided to ask again. I left the cabin and headed towards the main corridor, where I noticed the same young woman in the uniform that I had met earlier. I stopped her, trying to sound calm despite my growing concern. "Excuse me," I said, "but I have a question about the duration of the cruise. It seems to me that we have been sailing for at least 60 minutes. Has the initial duration of the cruise changed?" The woman looked at me with the same unchanging smile. "No, everything is going according to plan," she answered calmly. "The initial cruise duration is correct, and the remaining time is 3 hours. Please do not worry. Everything is proceeding according to schedule." My concerns began to turn into panic when I heard the crew member's response, which failed to reassure me. Time seemed distorted, and each further assurance that everything was fine only deepened my anxiety. Without thinking, I approached one of the passengers who happened to be nearby and asked him how much longer the cruise would last. "Excuse me, how much longer will this cruise last?" I asked, trying to sound as factual as possible despite my growing tension. The passenger looked at me confused and then at his watch. His face took on an expression of distress as he replied, "Another 3 hours. Why are you asking?" As I tried to process his response, a crew member appeared from the side. His face, still widely smiling, now seemed less friendly. He approached me and said in a cold, controlled tone, "Please calm down. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will be forced to call the captain." I remembered the rules. I had broken Rule 3. They knew. I felt my heart beat faster, but I knew I couldn't afford to panic further. I calmed down as much as I could, though thoughts of what might happen if the captain was indeed called only deepened my unease. I slowly returned to my cabin, trying to process all the information I had gathered. I analyzed the rules I received and concluded that the best solution would be to spend the rest of the voyage in my cabin. The rules indicated that in case of doubt, it was best to avoid contact with the surroundings and stay in a safe place. I felt that staying in the cabin, away from the strange and unsettling events on deck, would be the safest option. I began to calm down and think about how to use this time, trying to find peace in isolation. However, after about 20 minutes of silence, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible scratching coming from the walls. I felt my heart begin to race. Rule 2. I stood still, trying to ignore the growing sound, but the scratching started to intensify. What began as a quiet murmur turned into more pronounced and increasingly disturbing noises that seemed to be getting closer. At that moment, fear took full control over me. The rules that had previously seemed merely strange now became a reality that I could not ignore. Panic grew as the sound became more intense. I could no longer endure. Without thinking, I ran out of the cabin, feeling my heart pounding wildly. I left the closed door behind and ran down the corridor. As I fled the cabin, I felt the panic subside as I moved away from the scratching sounds. In the corridor, I noticed that the staff's demeanor had changed. Their faces had become rigid and inscrutable, though they still wore smiles. But this time they were wider and longer. Each crew member's eyes tracked my every move, as if they were waiting for something to happen. As I walked down the corridor, I felt their gaze, which seemed to literally burn. I felt growing tension as I noticed 2 staff members had started following me. Their presence was initially discreet, almost unnoticeable. They kept a proper distance, not getting too close, but close enough to give the impression that they were right behind me. No matter how fast I walked, each of their movements, every step, was almost synchronous with my own. I felt their gazes piercing my back, and their silence became increasingly unsettling. Although they tried to keep their distance, they were getting closer with each step. Eventually, I couldn't bear the pressure anymore and started running. At the same moment, they did too. "Please stop," one of them shouted. But I didn't listen. Running blindly was my only hope. As I ran down the corridor, I noticed that the passengers completely ignored me. Their ignorance was terrifying. They acted as if I weren't there. As they closed in, I made a risky decision, which seemed to be the only possible solution in this situation. I descended to the engine room. I felt that this place, though unpleasant, might offer me temporary shelter. I quickly ran down the stairs to the lowest deck, where the engine room was located. When I arrived, I noticed that the staff did not follow me further. They clearly feared this place. The engine room was a vast, dark space full of noises and heat. Old rusty pipes and steel elements formed a labyrinth, containing huge engines, whirring pumps, and powerful generators. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and exhaust fumes. The light was dim, barely illuminating the room and casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. Pipes and wires, tangled like snakes, ran along the walls and ceilings, and droplets of oil dripped from several places onto the floor. Every step I took echoed in this empty industrial space. I stopped by one of the engines, trying to calm my breath and process what was happening. As I hid behind a large engine in the engine room, trying to control my panic, I suddenly saw something that completely shocked me. In one of the darker corners of the room stood a figure, a woman staring at me with a strange, unnatural smile on her face. She was a few meters away, and her presence in this place seemed completely out of place. Her face was pale, and the smile, although it might have seemed polite at first glance, quickly transformed into something far more terrifying. As I watched her, her form began to deform. In some places her charred bones were visible, and her skin took on a pale, grayish, rocky appearance, as if stretched over too large a skeleton. Everything happened in slow motion, yet too quickly for me to react. Her body began to contort grotesquely, as if it were not bound by any physical constraints, and I heard the sounds of cracking bones. Her hands, which had previously been elegantly placed by her sides, now took on irregular claw-like shapes, stretching in a terrifying way. And her face, oh my god, her face was full of horrifying details. Her pale skin, once soft and human, was now grotesquely distorted, as if it had been burned in a catastrophic fire. The remnants of her formerly normal face were covered in brown and black scars that resembled cracked, ashy crust. The smile that once might have seemed polite now stretched unnaturally wide. Her gaping mouth revealed teeth that looked too long and sharp, as if they were the remnants of a former smile. Deep black scars pulsated around her lips, enhancing her terrifying grimace. The eyes were the worst nightmare. Their original color and shape were completely distorted. Where normal eyes once were, now they were large black voids filled with a strange, glowing light. Cracks extended around her eyes as if the skin had been burned, creating irregular, horrifying edges. Frozen in terror, I watched as her form transformed into this monstrosity. I heard her scream as she finally began to move, a shriek that cut through the silence of the engine room, echoing off the steel walls and amplified by the sound of the machines. With the last of my sanity, I decided to hide in one of the narrow service cabinets nearby. These small rooms were used for storing tools and spare parts. I slipped into one of these cabinets in terror, trying to close the door silently. Inside there was complete darkness, and the air was heavy with the smell of oil and rust. I could barely move, but tried to make no noise. I heard the horrifying scream of that thing outside the cabinet. Her scream echoed off the metal surfaces. Through the small gaps in the cabinet doors, I saw flickering lights and shadows moving through the engine room. The woman moved with terrifying speed, her figure shifting from place to place, sometimes disappearing into the shadows only to reappear elsewhere instantly. Each of her movements was accompanied by the sound of breaking bones. As her horrifying scream grew closer, my heart beat faster. I felt cold sweat running down my body, and adrenaline had me almost completely frozen in fear. I knew I had to stay hidden in this cramped shelter as long as possible, hoping that she wouldn't notice me and that I would survive this nightmare. I didn't know how much time had passed while I crouched in that narrow service cabinet. Time seemed to move slowly, and the sounds around me were both terrifying and overwhelming. The woman's screams didn't stop, and her rapid, unpredictable movements only heightened my fear. Every sound, every crack sent shivers down my spine as I tried to stay calm, though my body was numb from cold and terror. Eventually exhaustion, stress, and fear took their toll. I fainted. The last thing I remember was the sight of the woman slowly approaching my hiding place. When I regained consciousness, the engine room was silent. With trepidation, I opened the cabinet door and cautiously peered outside. The space was now deserted and quiet, as if the terrifying spectacle had come to an end. The engine room, though still filled with the sounds of machinery, was calmer, and the horrifying presence had vanished. I slowly exited the cabinet, trying to make no noise. As I left the engine room, my legs were stiff and trembling, but I tried to stay calm and move quickly. Every step felt laborious, but I needed to get out, find a safe place, and assess what to do next. With a mix of relief and terror, I finally managed to leave the engine room. As I was leaving, I swear I saw her. She was hanging from the ceiling in an unnatural position, just above my cabinet. Her terrifying figure was suspended in the air in a way that seemed utterly impossible. Her distorted face was staring directly at me, and her huge black eyes seemed to penetrate the darkness, tracking my every move. A cold shiver ran through my body, and every hair on me stood on end. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her horrifying stare, which expressed something more than ordinary fear, something deeply terrifying, almost supernatural. I felt my heart race faster, and the sense of panic grew as I tried to find a way to escape. With dread and terror, I left the engine room, still feeling her terrifying presence lingering above me, accompanying me with every step. With anxiety and determination, I sneaked to the top of the ship, searching for shelter and desperately trying to find a way to escape. I reached the deck where the lifeboats were located. My heart was pounding wildly, and my hands shook with fear, but I knew I had to act quickly. I approached one of the lifeboats, trying to quietly open its hatch and prepare it for launch. Every sound seemed loud and revealing, and I tried to be as silent as possible to avoid drawing attention. However, just when I hoped I might escape, I noticed that the ship's crew was approaching me. Their faces were unreadable, but their demeanor was resolute and determined. I quickly realized that their expressions were cold and filled with unease, and their smiles, which had seemed strange before, were now entirely absent. I had nowhere to run. They had surrounded me. As the crew approached, I noticed that one of them stood out from the rest. He was an extraordinarily tall man, about 3 meters tall. His presence was imposing, almost overwhelming. He was dressed in a suit that differed from the other crew uniforms. It was dark gray and elegant, with a subtle shiny sheen that drew attention. His presence was unsettling. His formal and elegant stance emanated something decisive and authoritative. That was when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I looked at his face. The only thing I noticed before I realized who he was his cold, piercing eyes staring directly at me. Then it dawned on me. He was the captain. I had broken Rule 1. I knew what that meant. There was no option but to follow Rule 5. I decided on a desperate measure. I jumped into the icy sea, hoping that this leap would be my only chance for survival. The water's temperature was brutal, almost immediately shocking my body. The cold pierced through my bones, and the freezing water seemed impenetrable. Every movement in the water was painful, and the agony was almost unbearable. The water was colder than anything I had ever felt, draining all my energy. I struggled to stay afloat, fighting against the powerful waves that battered my body. The cold wind howled, and the darkness of the night made it hard to gauge how far I was from the ship. Every second spent in that water felt like an eternity, and hope for rescue dwindled with each passing moment. With cold dread, I watched as the ship slowly disappeared from view. Its massive silhouette, which had moments ago dominated the horizon, began to shrink and vanish into the darkness. The deck lights, which had given me hope, were now just faint points in the darkness, gradually fading from sight. As the ship grew more distant and its outline less distinct, I felt overwhelming isolation. When it finally disappeared completely from the horizon, I was alone on the icy sea, surrounded only by the cold black water. I eventually gave up, seeing no chance of survival. Due to hypothermia, I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was no longer in the icy sea. Instead, I lay in a hospital bed surrounded by white walls and sterile light. My body was wrapped in a warm blanket, and various medical devices monitored my vital signs. For a moment, I felt lost and disoriented, unable to understand how I had ended up in this place. Soon after I regained full consciousness, a nurse entered the room, surprised by my awakening. She told me that I had been found by a container ship passing through that area of the sea, heading toward the town where I had started my voyage. Their crew had spotted me drifting in the water unconscious, and had immediately carried out a rescue operation. Thanks to their swift action and professionalism, I managed to survive. Several days passed before I was finally able to leave the hospital. When the doctors deemed me stable enough to leave the facility, I couldn't wait to return to normal life. Unfortunately, as soon as I left the hospital, another devastating piece of news awaited me. My mother had died. I learned that her health had deteriorated drastically while I was at sea. Due to my sudden disappearance and inability to contact her, she had no one to support her in that critical moment. Her death was a shock to me. The only reason I had taken the voyage was the hope of seeing her in time and providing her with support. The sense of guilt and sorrow was overwhelming. Although I was glad to have survived, the realization that my mother had passed away while I was fighting for my life was an unimaginable burden. After returning from the hospital and discovering that I had inherited the family home and a modest fortune, I hoped that returning to my roots would bring me peace and solace. My father was dead, and I had no siblings. Despite not inheriting a vast fortune, the house, which was part of my heritage, became a symbol of the past and a place where I could find refuge. I decided to return to the family home, believing that within its walls I would find a sense of belonging and safety. I bought a plane ticket for a very small portion of the inherited money to get me there, and said goodbye to the remnants of my previous life. As I boarded the plane, my anxieties were significantly less overwhelming than before. However, as I passed through the gates and entered the aircraft, I began to question whether the cabin crew always had such unnaturally wide smiles.